When you think of South Asian Muslim heritage, what comes to mind? Because I think when we give thought to Muslim contributions to culture, we might think about architecture, calligraphy, maybe poetry and literature, maybe science, maybe music, but we don't usually think about dance. So before I dive further into this talk, I want to just state that South Asia is a broad area and it includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and Afghanistan. And today, in this talk, I want to take you on a journey across parts of South Asia and beyond, exploring how dance reveals histories of trade, migration, faith, and cultural exchange. I will focus on a few of these areas and dance styles, but there are so many more. And I also want to look beyond the borders of South Asia because I want to show how Muslim dance culture connects South Asia with Central Asia, Persia, Arabia, East Africa, and indeed the rest of the world. And it's also to remind us that borders are more of a recent phenomenon where lines were drawn on a map and it separated communities who coexisted and shared cultural heritage and more. So for this talk, I'm going to ask you to think outside of modern nationalism and the nation state's box. I'm basing this talk on my recently published book, Dance Histories, A Journey Across the Muslim Silk Road. The book has a wider scope, but for this talk, I'm focusing on South Asia because it's South Asian Heritage Month. So when people hear the words Muslim and dance together, there is sometimes a sense of contradiction. There is an assumption that Muslims don't dance or that faith and movement must somehow be in opposition to one another, or B, the other extreme is that Muslim dance is presented through an Orientalist image of exotic semi-naked women performing in a harem for the enjoyment of men. And neither of these ideas reflect the reality of Muslim culture and history. And I really wanted to rescue dance from this narrative and to decolonize our dance heritage. Because across the Muslim world, we find shared religious ideas and philosophies, and these interacted with then existing local cultures to produce a remarkable diversity of traditions, including dance. And dance has existed for millennia and has also been embraced and practiced in the Muslim world as a social tradition, a spiritual practice, and a way of bringing communities together. So colonialism didn't just take land, it also shaped which histories were told or considered important. Histories have also been erased, appropriated, or twisted. So when I began researching my book, I found surprisingly little written about Muslim dance heritage. It was almost as though that history did not exist. But I knew that that could not be true because I had seen it, I had experienced it, and I had danced it. So my work became an attempt to uncover those missing histories. And it's important to say that I'm approaching dance as a historian. I'm interested not only in how people move, but in what those movements can tell us about migration, about faith, colonialism, about people's identity, the communities they lived in, and the sense of belonging. Because dance is not simply entertainment. Dance is one of history's living archives. It can tell us stories that history books sometimes leave behind. To understand this heritage, we need to think about the world before modern national borders. Because for centuries, South Asia was connected to a much wider network of trade and migration. The Silk Road was a vast network of land and maritime routes that linked China, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Persia, the Middle East, East Africa, and the Mediterranean. and traders traveled between ports, often settling and forming new communities. The Silk Road carried spices, silks, precious stones, and other goods, but it also carried ideas. It carried religion. For example, Christianity was from Bethlehem and it went to the world. And movement and dance also traveled. But dance doesn't leave behind the same records as a building or a written document. It is passed from one body to another, and this is how movement survives. Islam also traveled through many of these routes. Muslim traders, scholars, and Sufi spiritual teachers moved between regions and helped create shared spiritual and cultural networks. Sufi poetry, devotional music, and practices of remembrance spread across different societies. So when we look at Muslim dance traditions, we are not looking at isolated national cultures. We are looking at a history of movement across borders. And my research has found a spiritual core amongst the Muslim dance cultures, as well as similar aesthetics, geometric style, and movement genres. For over 1,000 years, Muslim communities became deeply rooted in South Asia. Arabs arrived as early as the 8th century in Sindh, and then Turkic, Central Asian, and Persian influences came with the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. These Muslim rulers brought traditions that existed with and they interacted with existing South Asian languages, music, poetry, dress, food, art, and architecture, creating something new, an Indo-Muslim culture. And dance was one of the expressions that shared a cultural heritage. For me, this history is not only academic, it's also deeply personal because my own family history was affected by the partition of India in 1947. Partition led to the creation of India and Pakistan and later Bangladesh in 1971. And it caused one of the largest displacement of people in modern history. More than 50 million people were displaced, and my grandparents became among those who became refugees in Pakistan. And members of my family later came to Britain. My great grandfather arrived in the 1950s, and my mother came to the UK in 1962. And that experience of displacement and migration became part of our family history. My family's heritage is connected to North India, but because of partition and the continuing political relationship between India and Pakistan, that heritage can sometimes feel cut off. And that includes certain forms of cultural expression, including dance. And after 1947, people who had previously shared cultural traditions were increasingly expected to understand themselves through new national and religious identities. Both India and Pakistan began constructing their own national stories. So certain cultural traditions were emphasized while others became uncomfortable or politically difficult. In Pakistan, some dances became strongly associated with India and were therefore distanced from, even when those dances had important Muslim histories. Kathak is one example, which I will come to in a moment. And Bhangra's connection as well to Muslim Punjabis is also less known. So when my grandparents first came to Britain, they would listen to songs from the homeland they had left behind. They gathered with other Pakistanis and they would sing and dance together. And my family hosted the Pakistan Dance Academy at several occasions. And these events helped them remain connected to the people, places, and the culture they had lost or left behind. And music and dance also became a way of passing culture from one generation to another. And this is why dance matters when we talk about migration and displacement. It doesn't only preserve movement, it carries emotional memory, cultural stories, and history. So I'm going to first talk about Kathak. This is the first dance that I want to explore because Kathak is recognized as one of the major classical dance forms of India. It's earliest roots lie with traveling storytellers known as Kathakers, who used gesture and expression, music and movement to bring religious stories to life. But the Kathak we recognize today was also profoundly shaped by centuries of Muslim courtly patronage and cultural style. Under the Delhi Sultanate and later the Mughal Empire, Kathak evolved from a storytelling tradition into a sophisticated court dance. It absorbed Persian aesthetics, etiquette, poetry, music, and costume. Its graceful movements, its intricate footwork, repeated spins, and expressive storytelling all developed within this rich Indo-Persian cultural world. Kathak is a beautiful Indo-Muslim dance tradition. It represents centuries of collaboration between Hindu and Muslim dancers, musicians, poets, and patrons. For me, Kathak is one of the greatest examples of shared cultural heritage. But then came partition. Kathak became celebrated as one of India's great classical dance traditions. And in Pakistan, however, it increasingly came to be viewed as something Indian. And they wanted to separate from that identity, despite the fact that much of its development had taken place under Muslim courts. And as a result, many Pakistanis gradually became disconnected from a dance that was also part of their own history. But that doesn't mean Kathak disappeared from Pakistan. There are still remarkable artists working to preserve this tradition. Nahid Siddiqui is a very famous Pakistani Kathak dancer, as well as Nigat Chowdhury, who has dedicated her career to teaching and performing Kathak in Pakistan, despite many challenges. Her work reminds us that Kathak is not foreign to Muslim identity or to Pakistan's cultural history. For me, learning about Kathak completely changed how I saw my own heritage. Growing up, I admired the beauty of Kathak, but I never really thought of it as part of my own story. It was only through my research that I realized how deeply the heritage was interconnected. Kathak teaches us something much bigger than the history of one dance. It reminds us that culture doesn't fit neatly into the political borders we have today. And some of our richest traditions were created together long before those borders existed. The next dance I want to speak about is the Attan, which is widely regarded as the national dance of Afghanistan. The Attan is usually performed as a group dance. Dancers move in a circle, often beginning slowly and becoming faster as the rhythm intensifies. The dance requires energy and coordination. And although it has particular associations with Pashtun culture, it is now performed by communities across Afghanistan and by Afghans in the diaspora. The history of Afghanistan is deeply connected to both Central and South Asia. For centuries, Afghanistan formed part of the routes linking Persia, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. The first Mughal emperor, Babur, was a ruler of Kabul before coming to India, and many rulers of the Delhi Sultanate, including the Lodi dynasty, were of Afghan origin, all connected to its heritage. People, armies, merchants, and spiritual teachers moved through this region. The history and heritage of Sufism is also very rich here. Sufi poetry is put to music and danced to. The Attan is performed at weddings, at festivals, and at national celebrations. But it also carries a sense of resilience. Afghanistan has experienced decades of war, invasion, displacement, and political instability, and many Afghans now live outside of the country. So the dance affirms a connection to Afghanistan. And Attan reveals another side of Afghanistan, one of music, of celebration and community and cultural pride. This is one of the reasons that dance matters. It gives communities the opportunity to represent themselves rather than being defined entirely by outside narratives. I want to also speak about Bhangra. because it is one of the most internationally recognized South Asian dance traditions. Sikh communities have played an enormous role in preserving and popularizing the dance, particularly in Britain. But the history of Bhangra is part of the wider shared heritage of Punjab. So before partition, Punjab was home to Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus, and communities lived alongside one another and shared many aspects of culture. Bhangra developed from agricultural traditions and seasonal celebrations. It was connected to farming, harvest, and the rhythms of rural life. And after partition, Punjab was divided. Muslims moved west to Pakistan, while many Sikhs and Hindus moved east to India. Communities that had lived together became separated, and over time, the cultural history of Bhangra was also divided. In India and the diaspora, Sikh performers played a major role in developing Bhangra into a powerful symbol of Punjabi identity. In Pakistan, Punjabi folk traditions continued, but the Muslim contribution to the shared history of Bhangra becomes less visible internationally. Yet Bhangra is still danced by Muslims. It remains popular at Pakistani weddings and celebrations, particularly among Punjabi families. Bhangra also tells an important story about Britain. For young British South Asians, it provided a way of being both British and South Asian, and it is now also a major British Asian cultural dance form. Bhangra in the UK brings together people whose families came from India, Pakistan, and East Africa. It therefore carries several histories at once. The next dance I want to talk about is Sufi dance, and more specifically, the Dhamal. Sufism is a spiritual or mystical dimension of Islam, and Sufi traditions place a strong emphasis on the love and remembrance of God and the inner spiritual journey. Poetry and movement have been important with many Sufi communities, and one of the most famous examples is the Sema of the Mevlevi order, commonly known as a dance of the whirling dervishes. The Mevlevi tradition developed around the teachings of the 13th century Persian poet and mystic Jalaluddin Rumi, who was actually born in Balkh in Afghanistan. The whirling is not intended as entertainment. It is a disciplined spiritual practice representing the soul's journey towards God. Sufism traveled far and wide across the Silk Road, and it also spread Islam because people were drawn to the spirituality, the poetry, music, and the spiritual leaders. And across South Asia, Sufi shrines became important centers of spiritual and cultural life. People visited shrines to pray, to remember saints, to listen to devotional music, and participate in communal gatherings. And Dhamal is a form of ecstatic movement performed at a number of Sufi shrines, particularly in Pakistan. So Sufi movement has really become part of Muslim cultural life for centuries. The next dance is Leva, and it's perhaps one of the clearest examples of dance across borders. It is performed by communities along the Makran coast on the Indian Ocean, and it includes parts of Pakistan and the wider Gulf region. Its history is connected to East Africa, Arabia, and South Asia, because for centuries the Indian Ocean connected the coast of East Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and the region that is now Pakistan. In India and Pakistan, one of the most prominent African descended communities is the Siddhi community. The Siddhi community came to India in the early days of Islam, and many rose to high rank in society. They were prime ministers, military commanders, senior administrators in the courts. They had Sufi heritage and have left a lasting legacy. There is a beautiful mosque built by Sheikh Sidi Sayyid, and it was built in 1573 in Ahmedabad in Gujarat. The Siddhi community have preserved aspects of African music and dance heritage. The culmination of Siddhi heritage and local dance is the Leva dance, and it's also practiced by Baloch communities in Balochistan and has become part of the wider culture of the Makran coast. The dance is often performed collectively and accompanied by strong drumming and wind instruments. Its rhythms have clear African, Arab, and South Asian influences. The leva is a result of centuries of exchange, and it is a beautiful reminder of that. The final dance I want to briefly consider is flamenco. Flamenco takes us beyond South Asia and across to Andalusia in southern Spain. Flamenco, as we recognize it today, was shaped as a fusion dance with influences from Muslim, Jewish, Roma, and Andalusian communities. A little context of this fusion: Muslims had ruled large parts of Iberia in 711 AD and were then expelled in 1492 from the last Muslim stronghold of Granada. During Muslim rule, Andalusia was a region where Muslims, Jews, and Christians had lived and interacted for over many centuries. Following the fall of Granada, Muslims and Jews faced forced conversion, expulsion, and persecution under the infamous Inquisition. And Roma communities, originally from North India, were also marginalized and persecuted. The Roma people originally migrated westwards from the Indian subcontinent, and particularly North India, over many centuries before arriving in Europe. And flamenco later emerged among the poorer and marginalized communities who interacted with each other in the underground scene. Flamenco's connection with South Asia can be seen in many of the movements, and some scholars and performers have noted similarities in expressive hand movements and rhythmic traditions, although flamenco developed its own distinctive artistic language in Andalusia. Flamenco therefore supports a central argument of this talk, that culture does not develop within sealed borders. It is created through encounters between people, including encounters shaped by migration, inequality, conflict, and survival. So why have so many of these histories been forgotten? And part of that answer lies in colonialism, because during the colonial period, European classical traditions were presented as refined, disciplined, and intellectually superior, while the artistic traditions of colonized people were dismissed as exotic, immoral, or uncivilized. Dance was particularly affected. In India, British Victorian attitudes transformed the way many performers were viewed. Dances were banned. Women who had been respected artists in royal courts and cultural centers were increasingly labeled as nautch girls or dismissed as prostitutes. Yet many of these women were accomplished performers, musicians, and poets, and some also supported the anti-colonial resistance, including during the uprising of 1857. Colonialism also shaped how Europe imagined Muslim women. Orientalist artists and writers created fantasies of harems filled with mysterious, exotic, and sexually available women. And these images reflected European imagination far more than the lived reality of Muslim societies. And as a result, Muslim dance became associated with fantasy and sexuality, rather than with its rich histories of spirituality, storytelling, celebration, and community. So decolonizing dance means challenging these inherited assumptions. It also means allowing communities to describe their own heritage in their own terms. Dance also evolved in many regions to become dances of resistance, and this tells its own deep colonial story as well. Today, many younger Muslims are beginning to reclaim their cultural and faith expression through dance. Social media has created new opportunities for people to present their identities on their own terms. We can see Muslim dancers combining traditional movement with hip hop, contemporary dance, and popular music. The Norwegian dance group, the Quick Style, who are led by Pakistani twin brothers and their Thai Muslim friend, is one example of young men working across different cultural influences. Their performances include South Asian music, popular dance, and references to Muslim family and wedding culture. They connect many dance cultures together, which I love, and they have reached a global audience while presenting Muslim identity as joyful, creative, and inclusive. And this matters because Muslims are so often represented through conflict, extremism, or suspicion, but far less attention is given to Muslim creativity, beauty, humor, and joy. And dance helps to redress that imbalance. It allows Muslim communities to tell their own stories in all their richness, complexity, and humanity. And in many ways, that is what reclaiming history is about. I would like to finish by returning to the idea of dance across borders. The examples I have discussed today are different, but together, these dances reveal a much larger story. They show that cultures have never existed in isolation. People have always moved. They have traded, migrated, married, and settled in new places. Movement is not a modern phenomenon. Modern borders can make these connections difficult to see. And colonial histories and nationalist stories have also done a lot of damage and fostered a separation and intolerance between different communities. But dance often preserves the connections. Dance has helped me understand those connections deeper. And as Maya Angelou said, you cannot really know where you are going until you know where you have been. And for me, recovering dance history is part of knowing more about myself. And dance crosses borders, it carries memory, it preserves connection, and it reminds us that despite the divisions created by colonialism, partition, and nationalism, our histories remain deeply intertwined. Thank you for listening. And if you like content such as this, please like this video and subscribe to my channel.